I was never messy. I was early. Wendy Williams testifies against Diddy and tears the veil off a culture of silence in hip-hop. Before she even spoke a word, the room could feel it. This wasn't going to be entertainment. This was going to be exposure. When Wendy Williams, once dismissed as tabloid royalty and written off as messy, stepped into the federal courtroom during the high-stakes trial of Sean Diddy Combs, she wasn't looking for redemption. She brought receipts. I was never bitter. I was never lying. I was early. Delivered with her signature cadence, but none of the daytime flair, Wendy's opening line landed like a hammer. The courtroom hushed. Legal pads filled. For decades, her warnings had been brushed off as gossip. But now, under oath, they were entered into the record of a federal case that threatens to undo the very architecture of hip-hop power. And this time, everyone was listening. The queen of hot topics steps into the eye of the storm. Wendy didn't arrive like a celebrity. She entered like someone who had clawed her way out of a grave, one the industry had dug for her using lawsuits, NDAs, and coordinated blackballing. They didn't just try to cancel me, they tried to erase me. Clad in muted tones and flanked by federal marshals, she took the stand with a stack of documents that read more like a war dossier than court evidence. Show transcripts, email printouts, internal memos, and a decade-long timeline of media manipulation, executive threats, and shadow intimidation. And at the center of it all? Sean Diddy Combs, the early 2000s, a warning ignored. Wendy began her testimony by rewinding the tape to the early 2000s, a time when her syndicated radio show was the heartbeat of hip-hop controversy. She described how mentioning Diddy's name, even in passing, would result in an immediate, calculated backlash. Within an hour of going on air, someone would call, not ask, not warn, threaten. Station managers would plead with her to dial it down. Advertisers disappeared. And then came the personal attacks, not metaphorical ones, physical ones. I talked about Total, she said, referencing the R&B girl group once signed to Bad Boy Records. I said they were broke. Within hours, they were waiting for me outside my building. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. NDAs, blacklists, and the culture of control. You couldn't touch Diddy, Wendy said, her voice unwavering. He wasn't just protected, he was untouchable. Wendy told the jury that executives at major media companies had long been complicit in building that wall of protection. She recalled being pulled into private meetings where she was offered more money, better ratings slots, if she just stopped saying certain names. I was told I was being reckless, she said, but I wasn't reckless, I was accurate, and they hated that. Wendy outlined how NDAs were routinely deployed, not as legal shields but as weapons, used to silence accusers, intimidate journalists, and sanitize celebrity reputations. If someone sued, the settlement came with a gag order. If someone talked, their career vanished. Jay-Z, radio silence, and the power structure behind the curtain. In a revelation that pulled audible gasps from the courtroom, Wendy linked Diddy's influence to a broader ecosystem of collusion and protection, implicating other high-powered figures like Jay-Z. Jay-Z didn't do the dirty work, but he helped keep things quiet, she said. It's all connected. If you protect one, the others protect you. She described an incident in which a major record label blacklisted her show from promotional tours, shortly after a segment in which she criticized the increasing corporatization of hip-hop. Behind the scenes, she later learned, calls had been made. I wasn't blacklisted because I was wrong. I was blacklisted because I was right too soon. A courtroom, not a couch. This wasn't hot topics. There were no applause cues, no purple chair. Just Wendy, under oath, saying what she had never been allowed to say on the record. For years, people said I was messy. They laughed when I broke down. But I'm still standing. And now you know why I cried. Her testimony didn't just indict Diddy. It dragged the spotlight to an entire system of complicit silence. where media conglomerates, award shows, and radio stations built careers and destroyed lives based on who stayed quiet. "This isn't just about Puff," she said. "This is about all of them. The ones who paid, the ones who protected, the ones who made sure I'd be too exhausted to keep fighting." But here she was, fighting. And as she finished her testimony and stepped down from the stand, the courtroom didn't erupt. It exhaled, as if a long-denied truth had finally found air. These weren't parties, they were operations. Wendy Williams names names and pulls back the curtain on Diddy, Jay-Z, and the industry's culture of grooming and retaliation. In federal court this week, Wendy Williams didn't just testify, she detonated. With the calm precision of someone who's been silenced too long, she traced the arc of her career, from radio icon to industry exile, and connected the dots no one else had dared to draw publicly. Until now. "You can blackball me, you can threaten me, but you can't erase me." She paused, locking eyes with the jury. "And now, I'm under oath. Collapse by design, the high price of telling the truth." Wendy described her career in the early 2000s as a battlefield. Each time she revealed something about Diddy, a domino would fall. A lost syndication deal. A vanished sponsor. A pulled invitation from a network that once begged for her ratings. "That's not bad luck, that's coordination." But she never stopped talking. "I was called toxic, but maybe you're now starting to see. I was just asking the questions no one else had the guts to." The Jay-Z connection. This wasn't a signing, this was grooming. Then the courtroom changed. When the prosecution asked Wendy to describe the culture surrounding Diddy, she pivoted sharply to someone else she had long warned the public about. Jay-Z. "You can't talk about Diddy," she said, "without talking about the people who stood beside him while it all happened, the ones who enabled him by staying silent. That includes Jay-Z." The gallery tensed. Wendy leaned toward the jury, voice measured but cutting. "Y'all remember Foxy Brown? She was 15. Jay-Z was 27. He was everywhere with her." She then held up a document, a printout of Foxy Brown's debut lyrics from an album Jay-Z reportedly helped write and produce. "Ain't no nah like the one I got. No one can me better." She read the words slowly, clearly. Each syllable made the courtroom recoil. "You tell me," she said, now staring into the jury. "Why was a grown man writing lyrics like that for a child?" She detailed rumors of grooming, stories long whispered behind studio doors, of Jay-Z picking Foxy up from her high school, showering her with lavish gifts, arranging hair appointments, and paying for shopping sprees. This wasn't a label deal. This was grooming. Then came something darker. There was a rumor, Wendy said, that a tape existed. Jay-Z, Foxy Brown, and Jamie Foxx. The courtroom froze. You never heard about it again. Why? Because suddenly, Foxy's home was burglarized, and the tape? Gone. She let it hang. Coincidence? I don't think so. Blackballed for asking the right questions. Wendy then described what followed. A few days after suggesting on air that Jay-Z's relationships with underage girls should be investigated, she was fired. Top-rated show. Gone. Just like that. She turned to the jury again. They didn't call me toxic because I was wrong. They called me toxic because I was right. And they couldn't let that spread. The prosecution asked if she had evidence of retaliation. She nodded. Emails? Call logs. Producers who backed out of collaborations after quiet calls from Jay-Z's team. They turned me into the villain, she said, just for asking the questions any decent person would have asked. The truth no one wanted to believe. Then came the line that cracked the courtroom. I was the first to say it, Wendy said. Those weren't parties, they were operations. Not after parties, not industry mixers. They were carefully curated spaces designed for control, manipulation, and silence. She described Diddy's notorious gatherings not as spontaneous celebrity blowouts, but rituals, where phones were confiscated, where young women were recruited, and where deals were made behind closed doors with the unspoken understanding that no one talks, no one leaves, and no one tells. And the people who showed up? They weren't just guests. They were part of it. The handlers, the scouts, the cleaners. According to Wendy, NDAs were handed out like wristbands, and those who declined, you never heard from them again. A reckoning, not a testimony. As she stepped down from the stand, there was no applause, just stunned silence. This wasn't a hot topic. It was a turning point. Wendy Williams had not come to play the villain. She came to testify, and in doing so, tore down the fourth wall of an industry built on secrecy. They thought I was gossip, she said. Turns out, I was the archive. From gossip to evidence, Wendy Williams lifts the lid on the freak-offs, the Cassie warnings, and the house of secrets Diddy built. When Wendy Williams uttered the phrase, "Those weren't parties, they were operations," she wasn't speaking in metaphor. She was speaking from first-hand accounts, industry whispers, buried radio segments, and private confessions that had haunted her for over 2 decades. And now, under oath, those whispers were becoming testimony. Evidence, history, the freak-offs, from urban myth to federal indictment. I heard about them back in the late 90s, Wendy began. And let me tell you, they weren't just parties, they were rituals. What had long been dismissed as tabloid sensationalism, the so-called freak-offs, allegedly hosted by Sean Diddy Combs, was now central to a federal indictment. And Wendy, with chilling composure, laid out the blueprint. Phones confiscated at the door. Guests forced to sign NDAs. Escorts with candles guiding people to rooms. Cameras positioned, not just for security, but for leverage. Instructions on what to wear, who to touch, and where to go. This wasn't socializing, she said. It was organized depravity. She invoked a name well known to her listeners, Karen Superhead Steffens, a former video vixen who had once come on Wendy's radio show and dropped the curtain on one of these events. Diddy asked her for male involvement. He was paranoid, on drugs, afraid she'd expose him. Wendy recalled playing that interview not once, but multiple times on air, because the truth was too heavy to just let pass. Baby oil, IV bags, and medical staff on standby. Then came the detail that stunned the courtroom into silence. I joked about it on the air back then, Wendy said. But it wasn't a joke. The baby oil. Over 1,000 bottles. Just like I said. She produced a sealed document listing pseudonyms, individuals who had confided in her privately about what they'd witnessed. Many were now cooperating with prosecutors. Their stories, chillingly consistent, echoed what had already been laid out in sworn testimony by Cassie Ventura, Gene Deal, and Lil Rod. They told me they saw 4 bags, hooked up the next morning to rehydrate guests. They said medical assistants were on standby. This wasn't indulgence, it was extraction. What the public once laughed off as gossip, the courtroom now understood as evidence. Wendy sat back in her chair, eyes locked on Diddy. All these years later, and here we are. Not a rumor, a record Cassie Ventura. She didn't need a boyfriend, she needed a bodyguard. Wendy then pivoted to someone she had been trying to protect, publicly, for over a decade. Cassie Ventura, she said, was never just a girlfriend. She was a prisoner. Wendy testified that as early as 2008, she had warned listeners that something about Diddy and Cassie's relationship felt wrong. She was 19, he was nearly 40. That's not love. That's leverage. She reminded the court that Cassie had no visible support network, no consistent handlers of her own, and no freedom of movement. Jets, private security, industry clout. He didn't just date her. He controlled her. Wendy recalled a now-archived radio segment in which she played a video clip from an awards show interview. Cassie, seated beside Diddy, had looked down and flinched when his voice raised. She wasn't scared of the cameras, Wendy said. She was scared of the man next to her. Years later, Wendy's analysis now reads like foreshadowing. The exact behavior she flagged, coercion, isolation, manipulation, is now at the core of Cassie's federal complaint. Back then, people said I was reaching, but the only thing I reached for was the truth. The machine and the message. By this point, the courtroom no longer saw Wendy Williams as a gossip queen. They saw her for what she was, a whistleblower. One who had been broadcasting warning signals into the void, while the machine tried to shut her down. When I said those things, Wendy told the jury, they pulled my ad buys. They told execs I was too much. But what I said then, you're finally hearing now. In court, under oath, from the victims themselves. What does that tell you? As Wendy stepped down, Diddy's legal team could only exchange panicked glances. The gallery was still. The judge called for a break, but no one moved. Because the purple chair was gone, and the courtroom was now her studio. And the only thing louder than her voice was the silence of everyone who once told her to shut up. You don't get to talk about men like Diddy and walk away clean. Wendy Williams testifies to being silenced, blackballed, and threatened for exposing the truth. They called it gossip. They laughed. They warned her. But in a federal courtroom packed with jurors, legal teams, and journalists who had once written her off, Wendy Williams finally finished the sentence no one else dared to begin. You don't get to talk about men like Diddy and walk away clean. I knew that. But I didn't know how deep it would go until it happened. It wasn't nerves. It was trauma. Wendy's voice didn't tremble. It slowed. And that was more powerful than any shout. She described the emotional breakdown she witnessed, not her own, but Cassie Ventura's. Years before the world took notice. Years before the court system caught up. People called it nerves, Wendy said. I called it trauma. But nobody listened. The prosecution submitted into evidence a timeline of Wendy's past broadcasts, highlighting how her commentary over the years had eerily foreshadowed the very claims now made in Cassie's federal lawsuit. I was told he had access to her phones, that he'd show up at hotels unannounced, that staff were ordered to unlock her doors. And when Wendy said these things out loud on air, my show sponsors pulled the plug. A mogul's power. They don't ask, they rearrange the world. She referenced a 2018 incident where Cassie reportedly ended her relationship with Diddy after he forced his way into her home. That wasn't the first time, Wendy said. When a mogul wants control, they don't need permission. They make the world rearrange itself for them. What followed was one of the most chilling and articulate breakdowns of abuse masked by celebrity ever heard in open court. Grooming, isolation, obedience dressed up as luxury. He didn't just love Cassie, he owned her. And when she broke the chain, she became dangerous. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Everything in that lawsuit, Wendy said, pausing to compose herself. I saw the signs. I said it publicly. And now she's finally being heard. But at what cost? The message. Stop talking about Puff or else. Then Wendy adjusted her mic and told the story no network wanted her to tell. 2004. Her show at the top of the ratings, her platform unmatched. And then, a warning. A record executive told me, stop talking about Puff or else. She didn't stop. And the very next week, she was pulled from her afternoon time slot. They didn't even pretend it wasn't about him, she said. It was punishment. Wendy testified that she learned from multiple industry sources that Diddy himself had made the calls, quiet but strategic. To label heads, to promoters, to radio networks, he told them, distance yourself from Wendy. One program director was blunt. You poked the wrong bear. Total, the lobby, and a public warning. Wendy described in vivid detail an incident that has since become infamous among her most loyal listeners, the day she was confronted outside her radio station by members of the girl group Total. I called them washed up and broke on air. A few hours later, they were waiting outside my building. This, she made clear, was not a coincidence. That wasn't a confrontation. That was a message. We can get to you. She described the scene. Fans pressed against the studio's glass lobby, her intern in panic, her boyfriend waiting in the car. That wasn't random. They were sent. Disinvited, erased, and targeted. The fallout was swift. Disinvited from BET events. Media credentials revoked. Sponsorships vanished. And Wendy brought proof. She presented printed emails from PR firms that had once represented Bad Boy Records, each one confirming that they were now distancing themselves from her platform. Diddy didn't just want to stop me, he wanted to erase me. And for a while, she admitted, he almost did. But now, under oath, and before the very institutions that once mocked her, Wendy Williams had the floor. They said I was messy. But what do you call it when the mess turns out to be the truth? The list, the lies, and the legacy of silence. Wendy Williams. Names, and systems in her most explosive testimony. Yet the room was silent, not with confusion, but comprehension. By the time Wendy Williams finished reading the internal PR email aloud, per client instruction, we will no longer be booking talent on Wendy Williams' show. There was no doubt left in the gallery. That client, she said, holding the page between two fingers like a receipt, was Sean Combs. Wendy paused. Let it land. I wasn't the first to be blackballed, she added, with a defiant tilt of the head, but I was one of the few who stayed loud about it. And now, all these years later, she had the jury. That's what he does, she told them, eye to eye. If you speak, you lose everything, your mic, your money, your name. But I didn't fold. I talked through the silence. And here I am. A very homosexual era of hip-hop. Then Wendy dropped a line that was both historical and incendiary. We come from a very homosexual era of hip-hop. It was a quote from her own past broadcasts, now revived with context, clarity, and consequence. That wasn't shade, she clarified. That was truth. And for saying it, I was burned at the stake. Wendy recounted how the early 2000s music media landscape was meticulously curated, with invisible lines you couldn't cross if you wanted to stay employed. I had Charlemagne on the air with me. Even then, we knew what not to say. She said it anyway. And the consequences followed her like shadow. She referenced her 2004 memoir, The Wendy Williams Experience, which many dismissed as a gossip archive, but which, today, reads like a sealed indictment in plain sight. It was full of coded references and veiled warnings. Diddy, Jay-Z, their after-dark lifestyles. People called it gossip. But now, the government calls it evidence. The shadow that ruins people. Wendy spoke about a 2009 radio interview with Mark Curry, a former Bad Boy artist who authored Dancing with the Devil. He called Diddy the shadow that ruins people. I agreed, and the interview vanished from the station's archives. She testified that nearly every time she brought on a guest who spoke truth to industry power, Karine, Superhead, Steffens, Gene Deal, Jaguar Wright, she was met with pressure, emails, threats, even FCC complaints. They tried to shut me down from every angle, Wendy said. I was flagged for my Hot Topics segments. Talent reps threatened to blacklist guests, and execs warned me, off the record, to back off. They didn't say, "You're wrong." They said, "You're dangerous." And then Wendy said what everyone in the courtroom was holding their breath for. There was a list. There was a list. Not written down, but everyone in the industry knew it. A list of people you couldn't talk about. Break the code. You paid the price. And when I broke that rule, she said, I paid. She described how she was disinvited from BET events, denied press passes, and watched as ad deals evaporated almost overnight. They didn't cancel me because I was messy. They canceled me because I was right. And they couldn't let that spread. Then she gave the courtroom its turning point. This isn't just about Diddy. Wendy turned back to the jury. Her tone dropped lower, more measured, like someone about to deliver a secret she's kept for far too long. This trial, she said, this isn't the beginning. This is the end of a cover-up. And I want you to know something. I've been sounding this alarm for 20 years. You all just finally heard it. Then her voice sharpened. You think this is just about Diddy? You're wrong. This is about the ecosystem that protected him. And then, with eyes locked on the panel of jurors, she named names. Tyler Perry, Oprah Winfrey. A stillness fell over the courtroom like a pressure drop before a storm. Wendy Williams unleashes the archive, the NDAs, the emails, the industry that protected Diddy, Perry, and Oprah. There's a list in Hollywood, Wendy said, her voice unwavering. Not one you'll ever see, not one you'll ever hold. But it's real. And if your name lands on it, you don't get canceled. You get erased. The prosecution had asked her to explain, and Wendy did, with brutal, surgical precision. She laid out the aftermath of her infamous broadcasts. This wasn't a meltdown. This wasn't tabloid theatrics. This was systemic retaliation. The machine that blackballed her, Wendy, recounted what happened after she called out not just Diddy's infamous freak parties, but what she called the quiet blackballing executed by Tyler Perry behind closed doors. I had sources, real ones, producers, agents. They told me flat out, Wendy, your name is being passed around. They don't want you touching certain topics. You're being labeled unstable. She recalled the implosion after her fallout with the Precious team, a film shepherded by both Tyler Perry and Oprah Winfrey. I went from being invited to every premiere, every red carpet, to being wiped off the guest list overnight. And then came the moment that broke her. Oprah's betrayal. Wendy testified that she once confided in Oprah Winfrey about her own past with abuse, privately, one survivor to another. She told me she respected me, that she'd never exploit that story. And the next thing I know, my abuser was on her show being interviewed, while I was being blackballed. The courtroom sat stunned. Jurors looked shaken. That wasn't just betrayal, Wendy said, steady now. That was retaliation. She pointed out the smiles, the handshakes, the photos with Diddy. They stood beside him while the rest of us got crushed for speaking out. You know why? Because they needed him. For deals, for reach, for silence. Then Wendy dropped the receipt. Wendy Williams returned to the stand with a bombshell, a mistakenly forwarded email from a PR firm with the subject line, Managing Optics, Wendy, Puff, Tyler. That was all it said, but to Wendy, it revealed everything. These aren't just celebrities, she told the jury. They're a machine built on silence, and it crushes anyone who tries to expose it. Then she pulled out a thick manila folder. Inside, a trove of NDAs and internal memos spanning nearly 2 decades, each a thread in a larger pattern of secrecy and control. One 2007 NDA, heavily redacted, detailed how signees had to surrender all rights to speak about personal, professional, or social interactions with Sean Combs, or risk financial ruin and asset seizure. These weren't contracts, she said. They were chains. Wendy read aloud from a clause warning that any violation may result in financial penalties and public retaliation. She slammed the page down. That's how deep it went. Then came another document, an internal email from a luxury hotel chain confirming preparations for Diddy's stay, extra linens, candlelit lighting, and discretion measures. It was from 2015, when Cassie was still publicly his partner. This wasn't partying, Wendy said. This was procedure, funded, scheduled, sanitized. She then revealed proof of payouts, money wired to PR firms, bloggers, security, and stylists to manage optics. One email even advised a writer to pivot away from controversy and highlight Diddy's educational and business contributions. Here's a condensed version of your text in American English, preserving the emotional weight and central message. In court, prosecutors presented a photo of Diddy, Tyler Perry, and a crisis PR consultant smiling at a 2019 gala. Wendy pointed out the hypocrisy: people smiling while silencing women with payouts and NDAs. She testified that she too was offered a lucrative deal to stay quiet and move on. She refused and suffered for it. Her message to the jury was clear. Diddy wasn't the only problem. There was an entire system behind him, a tower built on fear, silence, and complicity from powerful figures like Jay-Z, Oprah, and Tyler Perry. They shook his hand and silenced the rest of us, she said. Wendy closed by rejecting the labels thrown at her, bitter, crazy, and embraced the truth she fought for. Looking directly at Diddy, she declared the trial wasn't an ending, but the beginning of the tower's collapse. Then she walked out, silent, steady, unshaken.